Welcome to ND Love Story, where love stories are told with raw emotions and captivating storytelling. If you enjoy heartfelt and mesmerizing love stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to ND Love Story so you won't miss any episode. Evan Carter tightened his hoodie around himself, desperately trying to hide the damp stains spreading across his chest. He was used to this, the sudden wetness, the sticky discomfort, the fear that someone might get too close. But today, it was worse. The moment he stepped into the dorm room, he realized he wasn't alone. Ethan Reed, his roommate, was lounging against his bed, eyes fixed on his laptop screen. But as Evan walked in, Ethan glanced up, his gaze lingering for just a second too long. Evan froze, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. He needed to get to the bathroom before Ethan noticed anything. "Where are you rushing off to?" Ethan's voice was steady, but there was something in his tone, something knowing. Evan forced himself to stay calm. "I just need to wash my face." He turned toward the bathroom, but before he could take another step, Ethan frowned. "Hold on." Evan went rigid as Ethan moved closer, his eyes flicking toward the hoodie. Before Evan could react, Ethan reached out and tugged the collar down slightly, revealing the damp spot seeping through the fabric of his t-shirt underneath. A flicker of suspicion crossed Ethan's face. "What's this?" "Nothing." Evan yanked his hoodie back up and took a step back, his pulse racing. Heat rushed to his face. If Ethan figured it out? No, he couldn't let that happen. His fingers clenched around the fabric, desperately trying to conceal the undeniable evidence of his humiliating secret. Ethan was silent for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, he shrugged. "All right, if you don't want to talk about it, I won't push." His voice was calm, too calm. It unsettled Evan more than outright mockery or interrogation would have. He had braced himself for laughter, for relentless questions. But this unreadable reaction, made him even more anxious. That night, Evan barely slept. He could feel Ethan's gaze on him more often than usual. Had he noticed something? Did he suspect? Or was Evan just being paranoid? In the days that followed, Evan became even more cautious. He always wore extra layers, did his laundry late at night when no one was around, and stayed hyper-aware of his surroundings. But no matter how careful he was, he couldn't control everything. One evening, as he quietly scrubbed a milk-stained shirt in the dorm's shared sink, the bathroom door creaked open behind him. "You really thought I wouldn't notice?" Ethan's voice was low, steady. Evan spun around, his breath catching in his throat. Ethan stood there, arms crossed, eyes sharp but devoid of mockery. "What are you hiding, Evan?" Evan swallowed dryly, his hands gripping the hem of his shirt. But he had no answer. He stood frozen under Ethan's gaze, his heart pounding so loudly he swore the entire room could hear it. Ethan was staring at him, those deep, piercing eyes seeming to strip away every carefully guarded secret Evan had fought so hard to keep hidden. "Nothing," Evan stammered, quickly turning his back and pretending to continue washing his shirt. But he knew his words were far too weak to convince Ethan. Silence stretched between them before Ethan unexpectedly stepped closer. "If it's nothing, then why are you always sneaking around like this?" His voice was low and steady. Not mocking, not taunting, just patient. Evan clenched his fists around the fabric, trying to suppress the trembling in his hands. "It's personal." Ethan didn't press further. He simply studied Evan for a few more seconds before shrugging and walking away. But it wasn't the kind of shrug that meant giving up. It felt more like quiet confirmation. Like Ethan had figured something out and was now just waiting. That night, sleep refused to come. Evan lay awake for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts a tangled mess. And when he finally drifted off, his dreams pulled him into something both sweet and terrifying. In the dream, Ethan was close, so close that Evan could feel the warmth of his breath ghosting over his skin. Ethan's hand brushed against his hoodie, lingering just over the spot Evan had been trying so hard to conceal. "You don't have to be afraid," Ethan whispered. "I can help you." Evan jolted awake, his heart hammering in his chest. His fingers shot up to press against his hoodie, feeling the dry fabric beneath his touch. But the dream had felt too real, like it wasn't just something conjured by his subconscious. Turning his head slightly, he found Ethan already awake, propped up on one arm, watching him with an unreadable expression. "Nightmare?" Ethan asked, his voice casual. But his gaze never wavered. Evan gripped the blanket tighter, forcing his breathing to steady. "It's nothing." Ethan let out a quiet chuckle. But there was something in that smile, something that made Evan feel anything but reassured. The next day, Evan thought he could go through a normal day without worrying about being found out. But the moment he stepped out of class to head back to the dorm, that familiar pain spread from his chest. Not now, not in the middle of campus. Evan lowered his head, clutching his backpack tightly against his chest as he walked briskly. He had to make it back to his room before. "Evan." He froze at the sound of Ethan's voice behind him. When he turned around, he saw Ethan approaching with his usual steady steps. But his sharp eyes held a knowing look. Evan swallowed hard, trying to act normal. "What?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He just studied him for a few seconds before narrowing his eyes slightly. "Are you okay?" Evan nodded, but at that exact moment, a single drop of milk slipped from his shirt, staining the dark blue fabric. Ethan saw it. For a split second, everything seemed to slow down. Evan felt the world freeze around him. Panic surged through his chest. He wanted to turn and run. But Ethan was faster. He grabbed Evan's wrist, pulling him out of the crowded walkway and into a secluded space between two buildings. "What is this?" Ethan asked. And this time, there was no more suspicion, just a dangerous certainty. Evan wanted to lie, to come up with some excuse. But he couldn't. His whole body trembled, his fingers digging into the hem of his shirt. Ethan watched him for a long moment. Then, without warning, he shrugged off his jacket and draped it over Evan's shoulders. "Go back to your room," Ethan said, his voice dropping lower. "We need to talk." Evan couldn't meet his eyes. He could only nod silently. Knowing his secret was no longer something he could hide, he walked quickly back to his dorm, his mind in turmoil. The warmth of Ethan's jacket lingered on his shoulders, a quiet reminder that he couldn't keep running from this. This time, Ethan had seen. This time, there was no escape. He slipped into his room, shutting the door behind him. The pressure in his chest hadn't eased, but he was too shaken to focus on that. Taking deep breaths, he hoped Ethan wouldn't force him to face this right away. But only minutes later, the door swung open. Ethan stepped inside, his dark eyes unreadable, carrying a determination Evan had never seen before. "Evan," Ethan said, locking the door behind him. "Sit down." Evan shook his head, backing toward the bed. "I don't want to talk about this." Ethan didn't look away. "But I do." Silence stretched between them, so thick that Evan felt the weight pressing against his chest even harder. He clenched his hands, avoiding Ethan's gaze, but deep down, he knew he couldn't keep running from this. "You already know, don't you?" Evan whispered, his voice unsteady. Ethan nodded slowly. "I have a guess, but I want to hear it from you." Evan gripped the hem of his shirt tighter, his throat constricting. He had never said it out loud before, never dared to admit it. But in front of Ethan, in front of those unwavering, non-judgmental eyes, he knew he couldn't avoid it anymore. "I have a condition," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know why, but my body produces this." He swallowed hard, his chest rising and falling with his shaky breaths. "Milk." Ethan didn't react right away. No shock, no disgust, no laughter. He just looked at Evan, as if taking in the information with quiet seriousness. "How long?" Ethan finally asked, his voice softer than Evan expected. Evan bit his lip, lowering his head. "A year." Another pause. Evan felt his face burn with shame. He braced himself for revulsion, for rejection, anything but this unbearable silence. But what Ethan did next completely stunned him. Ethan stepped forward, easing himself down beside Evan. There was no pressure, no teasing, just his quiet, steady presence. "I'm guessing you've been dealing with this alone all this time." Evan blinked, his throat tightening. "I couldn't let anyone know. I was afraid they'd think I was a freak." Ethan let out a quiet sigh before, unexpectedly, reaching out to touch Evan's clenched hand. "You're not a freak." The light touch sent a jolt through Evan. He stiffened but didn't pull away. Ethan didn't let go either. Instead, he tightened his grip just slightly, grounding Evan in a way he hadn't realized he needed. Then Ethan released his hand, only to ask a question that left Evan completely stunned. "Have you ever tasted it?" Evan froze, every muscle in his body locked up. He snapped his head toward Ethan, but there was no amusement in his expression. His gaze remained calm, yet laced with a dangerous curiosity. I haven't, Evan stammered, his heart pounding. Why would you even ask that? Ethan shrugged, his eyes never leaving Evan. Just curious. The air between them thickened with something strange, something Evan couldn't name. The silence that stretched between them wasn't just tense anymore, it was something deeper. Something more unsettling. Then, without warning, Ethan stood up. Do you need my help with anything? Evan blinked, still reeling. Help with what? Ethan smirked but didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned down, brushing aside a stray lock of hair from Evan's forehead. A gesture so unexpectedly intimate that Evan's breath hitched. Anything you need, Ethan murmured, his voice low and rough. Evan swallowed hard, heat creeping up his neck. He couldn't tell what Ethan was thinking. Was this just kindness? Or was there something more? But one thing was certain. From this moment on, nothing between them would ever be the same. Evan couldn't stop thinking about Ethan's words. Anything you need, they echoed in his mind, tangled up with the unreadable look in Ethan's eyes. Did he really just want to help? Or was there something else beneath the surface? But Evan didn't have time to dwell on Ethan's motives. He still had to manage his condition. Still had to hide it every day. Yet after that night, Ethan didn't keep his distance. If anything, he seemed to insert himself even more into Evan's life. He was always there when Evan needed him. When Evan struggled with damp spots on his shirt, Ethan quietly handed him his jacket. When Evan was so stressed he was on the verge of breaking down, Ethan dragged him outside for a walk, as if he knew exactly what he needed before Evan even said a word. And then came that fateful day. Evan had tried to keep things under control, but his body had other plans. In the middle of lunch at the cafeteria, that familiar ache spread from his chest. His pulse skyrocketed. He gripped his tray tightly, desperately trying to keep his panic in check. But Ethan, as always, noticed immediately. Evan. Ethan's hand landed on his shoulder, his voice calm but firm. Are you okay? Evan swallowed hard, but before he could respond, he felt it, warm liquid seeping through his shirt. His breath caught. Panic hit him like a freight train. He shot up from his seat, nearly knocking over his tray, and bolted from the cafeteria. He didn't care who saw. He didn't care what they thought. He just needed to get out. Behind him, he heard footsteps. Evan, stop. But he didn't. Evan burst into the nearest restroom, slamming the door shut behind him and pressing his back against it. Chest heaving, his head dropped forward as hot tears spilled down his cheeks. What had he just done? He had made a complete fool of himself in front of everyone. The door swung open. Ethan stepped inside. Evan flinched. What are you doing here? Ethan didn't answer. He just looked at Evan, his expression steady, devoid of judgment. Then, without a word, he shrugged off his jacket and gently draped it over Evan's shoulders. Evan trembled. You're not disgusted? Ethan exhaled softly. Do you really think I would be? Evan bit his lip, unsure how to respond, but then Ethan stepped closer, a strange glint flickering in his eyes. I've always wondered what it tastes like. Evan froze. What? Ethan tilted his head slightly, lips curling at the edges. Your milk. Heat rushed to Evan's face. Ethan. But Ethan didn't laugh. He didn't smirk like it was a joke. He just looked at Evan, his deep eyes pulling him into something inescapable. Evan shook his head, desperate to escape whatever this was. But Ethan's hand suddenly brushed against his cheek, forcing him to meet his gaze. What are you so afraid of? Ethan murmured. Evan opened his mouth, but no words came out. Because the truth was, he wasn't just afraid of being found out. He was afraid of his own feelings. Afraid that he had already gone too far with Ethan. Afraid that Ethan felt the same way. After that day, Evan started noticing something strange. Ethan's phone. One afternoon, while Ethan was in the shower, Evan spotted his phone on the desk. The screen lit up with a message notification, a name Evan didn't recognize. Curious, he picked it up, and when the screen unlocked, the photos of him, not just casual snapshots, but private moments. Images of Evan discreetly washing his clothes in the bathroom. Photos of him clutching his chest on sleepless nights, struggling for control. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. Evan set the phone down just as Ethan stepped out of the bathroom. What are you doing? Ethan asked, his voice calm, not a hint of surprise, as if he had expected Evan to see. Evan opened his mouth, but no words came out. Ethan smiled, slowly, meaningfully. Did you really think I found out your secret by accident? A chill ran down Evan's spine. Ethan stepped forward, slow and deliberate, like a predator closing in. I've been watching you for a long time. Evan. Suddenly, it all made sense. Ethan wasn't just conveniently there whenever Evan needed help. He wasn't just a kind friend. He had been watching, all this time, and in that moment, Evan realized he had never truly had a choice. The dorm room felt smaller, the air heavier. Evan stood frozen, his breathing shallow as the puzzle pieces clicked into place. Ethan had known, not just recently, not just because of the slip-ups. He had known for a long time. Every coincidence, every lingering gaze, every moment Ethan appeared at just the right time to help, it had all been part of a plan. Evan took a step back, but Ethan stepped forward, closing the distance between them. What's wrong? Ethan's voice was smooth, warm, but beneath it, there was something unsettling. You're looking at me like I'm a monster. Evan swallowed hard. How long have you been watching me? Ethan didn't answer immediately. He only smiled, a slow, thoughtful curve of his lips. Since the day you moved into the dorm. The words sliced through Evan like a knife. Why? He whispered, his voice laced with confusion. Why would you do that? Ethan tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. Because you fascinate me. A shiver ran down Evan's spine. Fascinate? How? Ethan stepped even closer, close enough that Evan could feel his breath ghosting over his skin. I don't know, Ethan murmured, but I know I can't take my eyes off you. Evan struggled to steady his breathing, but his racing heart betrayed him. Should he be afraid, or was this something else entirely? You planned all of this? Evan bit his lip, searching Ethan's gaze for an answer. Since when? When did you decide? When I realized you were different. Ethan interrupted, his voice slow but firm. Did you think I wouldn't notice? The way you always hide your body. The way you flinch when someone gets too close? He tilted his head slightly, as if recalling every detail. I knew there was something unusual about you, and I couldn't resist wanting to know more. Evan clenched his fists, unsure how to react. You talk like I'm some kind of caged animal. Ethan chuckled, a low, rich sound that sent a strange thrill through Evan. No, Evan, I didn't put you in a cage. Gently, he lifted Evan's chin, forcing their eyes to meet. You locked yourself in one, with your own fear. Evan blinked, his heart hammering against his ribs. I'm not the first person to discover your secret. Ethan continued, his tone shifting, turning more serious, but I am the only one who never looked down on you because of it. Evan tensed at those words. Then what do you want from me? Ethan was silent for a moment. Then, he leaned in, pressing the softest kiss to Evan's forehead. You already know what I want. Evan froze. He knew. He had always known. And he also knew, there was no turning back now. Evan stood there, his mind blank in the wake of Ethan's unexpected kiss. Ethan had never touched him like that before. No teasing, no playful taunts, just a quiet, deliberate gesture, as if it had been inevitable from the start. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. He should push Ethan away. He should demand an explanation. Should question what this all meant. But he didn't move. He only stood there, frozen in place. Ethan watched him, his gaze deep and consuming, like a storm Evan had no escape from. Are you afraid of me? Ethan whispered. Evan parted his lips, but no sound came out. Afraid? No, that wasn't the right word. He wasn't afraid of Ethan. He was afraid of what he was feeling. Afraid that he didn't hate this. Afraid that, deep down, he wanted Ethan to cross that fragile line between them. That night, Evan couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind a tangled mess. He had no idea how much time had passed until his door slowly creaked open. Evan turned his head, his heart pounding as he saw Ethan standing there, his tall frame silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway. Ethan? Ethan said nothing. He simply stepped forward, then knelt beside Evan's bed. You can't sleep. It wasn't a question. Evan bit his lip. Neither can you. Ethan smiled. How could I when you keep running from me? Evan opened his mouth to argue. But Ethan leaned in, one hand resting on the mattress, closing the distance between them. Evan. Ethan's voice was low, as if whispering a secret. Have you ever wondered why I do all of this? Evan met his gaze. I don't know. Ethan let out a soft chuckle. But there was no teasing in it this time. Only sincerity. "I do it because I care about you." Evan's breath caught in his throat. Ethan reached out, his fingers grazing Evan's cheek with feather-light softness. "And I know you feel something too." Evan shivered at the touch. He could lie, could deny it, but Ethan's gaze was unwavering. "Certain, Ethan?" Evan whispered. Ethan didn't wait any longer. He leaned down, his warm lips pressing gently against Evan's. The kiss wasn't rushed, wasn't forceful, it was slow. Deliberate, not a claim, but a quiet declaration that the line between them had already been erased. Evan closed his eyes, letting himself fall into the moment. And for the first time in so long, he stopped running.